Hi, my name is Ron Williams. I've been invited by the CSLA to give a series of video conferences about the history and development of landscape architecture in Canada. Now, these conferences are based on my book that you see right here, which is actually called Landscape Architecture in Canada. In my book, I talk about 3 different types of landscapes. This beautiful public garden in Halifax is a great example of the first landscape type, designed landscapes. This kind of landscape is planned and realized by a particular person or persons, often a professional designer, for a specific location. We often know who the designer is and what school of thought or style their work expresses. This cemetery in rural Quebec represents a second category, the vernacular or cultural landscape. The designers of this category of landscapes are usually anonymous and are not professionals. Instead, they're people who have worked for a long time within an existing cultural tradition that they have absorbed and are comfortable with. The third type of landscape, represented by the spectacular scene in a national park in Alberta, might surprise you. It's the natural landscape, which of course is not created by human beings. But some natural landscapes have been set aside for protection by our society, and their roads, visitor facilities, and interpretation methods have usually been designed by professionals. Canada's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people lived off the land for millennia before the arrival of newcomers from other continents. They didn't desecrate the land, but they did have a dramatic impact on North America, creating such features as these ancient medicine wheels in southern Alberta. And this burial mound, in the form of a giant serpent, constructed some 2,000 years ago on a plateau above Rice Lake in Ontario. It's exactly the kind of place we would choose for a cemetery today. These red cedar totems tell the stories of the Haida people of Haida Gwaii, which is off the northern coast of British Columbia. In the far north, stone sentinels called inukshuks serve as landmarks and symbolic features for the native Inuit people. When European settlers came to Canada, starting in the late 1500s, human impacts on the land changed dramatically. Settlers came in successive waves from several European countries, and each wave tried to establish their own landscape patterns in different parts of Canada. Sometimes their interventions severely damaged the natural landscape, but gradually each one of them established attractive and orderly towns and what we might call mature agricultural landscapes. The first Europeans came from France, England, and Spain's Basque Country. They were attracted by the rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and their settlements were located in today's Atlantic provinces. The first Newfoundland settlements were temporary, but their flimsy stages and flakes, that's what those structures that we see here are called, were soon complemented by charming and irregular permanent townscapes like this one in St. John's. In contrast, the French settlements were usually built on carefully chosen sites according to precise plans. We see here the reconstruction of the fortress of Louisbourg, a walled city built on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia in the 1700s. It was built to guard the Acadian agricultural settlements along the shores. Much of the fortress was carefully rebuilt in the 1960s, but only dikes and vast pasture lands remain of the Acadian farming communities. But the main area of French settlement was in the St. Lawrence Valley, the heartland of today's Quebec. Here we see the long lot field pattern typical of French agricultural settlements laid out perpendicular to the rivers. The rural settlements in the cities, also located along the rivers, relied on the Catholic Church to provide their social institutions. These institutions were often situated in beautiful landscapes like this garden in a convent that has provided education since 1636, and in a peaceful suburban retreat for the clergy and students of Quebec City. A new wave of British settlement began in the 1740s, starting in the Maritimes. New towns were built, including Charlottetown, PEI. The town plan closely followed the regular layouts of the British American provinces to the south. They were laid out on easily defendable peninsula sites and grouped around institutional and residential squares. You can see one here, along with historic cemeteries like the Burying Ground in St. John, New Brunswick. This is Victoria Park, the central square of Brantford in Upper Canada, now Ontario. It's a town that continues that regular pattern we saw in the Maritimes. The square focuses on a local hero, Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant, and is flanked by the City Hall, the County Courthouse, 4 churches, the Public Library, and the Bell Telephone Building. This building is rather significant since the telephone was invented in Brantford. This city helps us to see how the central square was the hub of everything in those early days. Other Ontario towns followed more complex layouts, including the concentric plan of central Guelph, Ontario, with one of its main streets leading dramatically up to the impressive Catholic Church located on a hilltop. As these British colonial towns prospered during the 19th century, wealthy officials and merchants built elegant villas and gardens on their outskirts, often exploiting natural landforms and striking views. We see this in this summer residence of the first governor of Upper Canada, Castle Frank in Toronto, now memorialized by a subway station, and Mount Uniacke Estate in Nova Scotia. In contrast to Ontario, the Prairie West was subject to a great many cultural influences from the beginning, not just British. Many of the first settlers were actually retired French voyageurs, and here on the banks of the Qu'Appelle River in Saskatchewan is a scene that is straight out of rural Quebec. The traditional forms of the Ukraine, of Germany, and of many other European countries are found throughout the prairie provinces. The agricultural landscapes of the Prairie West are typified by vast spaces, big skies, and wooden grain elevators everywhere. These are symbols of human habitation in a vast land, like the silver spires of Quebec, but both of these landscape features are endangered species these days. Moving further west, the dry, short-grass prairies of southern Alberta are the home of cattle ranching landscapes, which have a distinct form and character of their own. The signs of early religious institutions remain present in the far west as elsewhere, and along the Pacific coast, early 19th century settlers developed their own vernacular landscapes, which were dominated by the majestic coniferous forests of that part of the country. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution had a great impact on cities all over the world. In Canada, new industries were created to harness the abundant resources of rivers, forests, and minerals. Everywhere, cities expanded rapidly and began to experience serious new problems, including overcrowding, pollution, poverty, and disease. The cities responded by inventing a new series of urban features and institutions, including police services, public transportation, water and sewer systems, and new kinds of public landscapes. One of these new landscapes was the Green Square that provided relief from long hours of labor. Here we see Montreal's 1860 conversion of a derelict Haymarket into a splendid public space, Victoria Square. Virtually all Canadian cities adopted this new kind of public space, including Western cities that were also expanding rapidly, although not yet subject to rampant industrialization. Here we see in both Regina and Calgary splendid open spaces from that era. Quebec City was particularly innovative in the 19th century. First, it resisted pressure to tear down its historic walls to accommodate urban expansion, and then it created a series of new and exciting urban features that are very much appreciated to this day, including the famous Terrasse des Gouverneurs, or Dufferin Terrace, that looks out on the St. Lawrence River. Other innovations of the time included broad, tree-lined boulevards, as here in Winnipeg, and such embellishments as statues and fountains, often provided by public subscription or philanthropy, like Gore Park in downtown Hamilton. During this public-spirited Victorian era, people were fascinated with plants and gardens. New horticultural discoveries from around the world inspired gardeners and designers everywhere, and municipalities and service organizations created magnificent public gardens, of which the Halifax Public Gardens was the most striking. The creation of large private gardens outside the city centre, already seen in the colonial era, continued and expanded. This new wave of villas and gardens was led by wealthy lumber merchants and other corporate leaders who were trying to escape the heat and the pollution of the cities, often caused by themselves, and the terrible epidemics of that era. The mid-19th century estates at Sillery, near Quebec City, which are now largely owned by public bodies and open to everybody, are excellent examples of this period. These picturesque private gardens helped inspire a new generation of cemeteries. Urban expansion meant that the small downtown burial grounds of the colonial era were totally insufficient. Cities sought new sites outside the developed city centers, often on hilltops or beside bodies of water. The whole idea of death and burial also changed at this time, causing the new cemeteries to focus on reflection and contemplation in beautiful environments. Such new burial grounds, called rural cemeteries, were soon created in every province, sometimes overcoming severe climatic limitations, as here in Calgary, and in other cases taking advantage of favorable natural sites and weather conditions, as in Victoria. This is the entrance to Mount Royal Cemetery, established in 1851 and designed by a well-known American landscape designer, James C. Sidney. Now, within an overall romantic and naturalistic environment, some of the graves are laid out in traditional fashion, in regular parallel rows, and are marked by headstones. But in other parts of the cemetery, more elaborate monuments and memorials have been erected. All in all, it's an environment that is conducive to contemplation and reflection, which was a whole new idea in cemeteries in the 19th century. Here we see some people just strolling through the cemetery, enjoying the ambiance. In fact, they might have nothing to do with the actual cemetery at all. This happened often during the 19th century. The new cemeteries were often crowded with picnickers and other people who were trying to enjoy the green space and fresh air. The cemeteries provided them with natural scenery and beautiful landscapes. It was just a step from there to the creation of new green areas which were specifically dedicated to recreation and scenery. These new green areas became the great urban parks that we know today. Here's one of those 19th century urban parks. It's Mount Royal Park, established in 1872 and located just beside Mount Royal Cemetery. We're looking at Beaver Lake, a central feature of the park that was actually created in the 1930s, and at the Beaver Lake Pavilion, built in the 50s, that you see on the right. The park attracts a lot of people of all ages and backgrounds. Many are happy to just walk along the broad path that borders the lake. Others like to get a little more exercise, enjoying a variety of activities including boating, observing the wildlife that flourishes in the park, or clambering over the rocky hill that encloses the south side of Beaver Lake. This is a big attraction for children. There are also quite a number of old-timers who are content to just take it easy on a park bench and watch what's going on. Now let's look at another part of the park that is a lot more active than what we see in this pastoral setting. Here on the east side of the park, facing Park Avenue, there's a lot going on. The atmosphere is very different from the quiet and reflective ambiance around Beaver Lake. This is the weekly Tam Tam gathering that draws a big crowd of drummers, dancers, vendors, and people who drop by to enjoy the fun. The gathering point is a monument honoring Sir George Etienne Cartier, one of the founders of Canada. It was erected in 1919 and is similar in form to many of the war memorials that were built at that time. It's a very pleasant and relaxed event and illustrates the tremendous variety of activities that the great urban parks have accommodated over their 150 years of existence, and it demonstrates their still crucial role in our cities. Here, at just about the highest point of Mount Royal, is another popular feature of the park. It's a magnificent rustic chalet that accommodates a restaurant and space for many other activities. When you arrive at the chalet, the approach path opens up into a broad plaza and a lookout or belvedere. From this belvedere, the visitor enjoys fabulous views to the downtown area of the city below, to the surrounding countryside, and all the way to distant horizons. Just adjacent to the belvedere, mounted on a giant boulder, is a discreet plaque that pays homage to the park's designer, Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted was the co-designer of Central Park in New York City, the first major park of this kind in North America. So it was not a surprise that, in 1872, when the City Council of Montreal wanted to create a similar park on Mount Royal, they engaged Olmsted. Here is a portrait of Frederick Law Olmsted, who is often considered to be the founder of landscape architecture in North America, along with his plan showing the original design for Mount Royal Park. Large urban parks were soon created across the country, and a former employee of Olmsted, Frederick Todd of Montreal, soon to be recognized as Canada's outstanding landscape architect, designed no less than 3 of our most famous such parks. The first was Assiniboine Park along the river of that name in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in 1903. Then in 1906, Todd designed Battlefields Park in Quebec City, more commonly known as the Plains of Abraham. And finally, in 1912, Bowring Park in St. John's, Newfoundland. All of these parks provided a great variety of recreational opportunities and scenic features. Many people consider the jewel in the crown of this generation of parks to be Stanley Park in Vancouver, located at the entrance to the city's harbor. Beacon Hill Park, just a few steps away from downtown Victoria, BC, is also a splendid example of this magnificent heritage. As railroads connected the scattered settlements of Canada in the late 19th century, inspired artists and regular citizens saw and appreciated the natural beauty of the country. There was a strong movement both to protect and to make accessible Canada's natural wonders, leading to the creation of national and provincial parks. The first of these parks were established by the federal government in the Rocky Mountains of the future province of Alberta and by the provincial governments of Ontario and Quebec, preserving essential water resources and the already threatened geological marvel of Niagara Falls. These spectacular parks were soon joined by other national parks across the country, creating one of the world's most extensive park networks. During this period, a new spirit of civic improvement began to take root in urban areas, in opposition to the general disarray, ugliness, and pollution typical of Canadian cities at that time. 2 main currents of design were invented to create better planned, more orderly, and more beautiful cities. The first of these 2 was called City Beautiful. This movement, based on ideas from France and the United States, emphasized splendid classical buildings, symmetrical compositions, and broad tree-lined boulevards linking the key elements of the city. It provided an ideal vocabulary for the new legislative and civic buildings that were being erected across the country, as well as the new university campuses established by the 4 western provinces in the first decades of the 20th century. The second design current of civic improvement of the time was the Garden City movement, begun in England in 1898 and rapidly emulated throughout the world. This movement placed more emphasis on social issues and the creation of healthy and attractive residential districts. It inspired the design of green suburbs and neighborhoods all over Canada. An outstanding example is Town of Mount Royal, founded in 1912 by a railroad company and designed by Frederick Todd, who we remember for the great urban parks mentioned a few minutes ago. In the first years of the 20th century, often known as the Belle Époque or the Edwardian era, Canada had become a relatively stable and prosperous country, and, as always, those who were the most prosperous expressed their wealth in the creation of splendid private gardens in striking natural locations. Many of these were on the west coast, and here we see, for the first time, influences on garden style coming from Asia as well as from Europe. The relatively peaceful Edwardian era was quickly obliterated by the coming of World War I in 1914, and all the civilized pursuits we have been following disappeared. They never came back in the same way after that devastating conflict. But the war left a powerful legacy in Canada's urban landscapes. In virtually every city or town, the central square or park hosts a somber memorial to those who were lost. Some of these memorials were powerful original sculptures, but most followed the pattern of the British cenotaph, a tall stone monument standing on a plinth, inscribed with tragic words, bearing stone wreaths, and supporting ancient flags. Here we see the cenotaph that stands in the center of Grand Parade in front of Halifax City Hall, and elsewhere in Halifax, the Hydrostone District, the only Canadian neighborhood rebuilt after its wartime destruction. This part of the city was destroyed by the Halifax explosion of 1917. Its design follows the Garden City model. A period of post-World War I prosperity inspired a new wave of splendid private gardens. Many of these, like the Parkwood estate of the McLaughlin family, owners of a large car company, later part of GM, were designed by professionals, but some were the creation of brilliant amateurs, including Prime Minister Mackenzie King's Moorside estate near Ottawa, and the celebrated Jardin de Métis, or Reeford Gardens, on Quebec's Gaspé coast, created by Mrs. Elsie Reeford and now a leading tourist destination. The economic depression of the 1930s that brought misery to so many Canadians was, paradoxically, a time of great originality and achievement in landscape architecture. Governments at all levels created new public parks and gardens to provide work for unemployed citizens. The renowned Montreal Botanic Garden was an example of this, as was the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Ontario, first established in an abandoned quarry. During this decade, a small but prolific group of landscape architects, including the designers of this particular project, banded together to form the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, or CSLA. That's the professional organization that regroups thousands of landscape architects across Canada today. A third outstanding public garden was also created in the Depression years, the International Peace Park that straddles the Canada-U.S. border in Manitoba and North Dakota. You're looking along the border right here, and you can't tell which side is which. Besides these famous botanic gardens, many civic and public infrastructure projects were created as part of the fight against unemployment, including bridges and boulevards, and these often attained a very high standard of landscape design. The achievements of the Depression era show that, once again, landscape architecture responded in a creative and effective way, just as it had to the twin crises of the 19th century, urbanization and industrialization. Towards the end of this period, just before the Second World War, a new approach to architectural and landscape design began to take root. This movement, called modernism, was to become a dominant force in the post-war years. Modernism emphasized simple geometric forms, mass planting, and new technological materials and construction methods. It eliminated decoration and stood for the creation of a new and more egalitarian society. In Canada, the movement began on the West Coast and was first expressed in residential landscapes. In response to a severe housing shortage in the post-war era, a series of new, large-scale urban districts were designed and built, closely following the principles of the Garden City movement we discussed earlier. One of the most original of these was Don Mills, near Toronto, designed by landscape architect and city planner Macklin Hancock. Canadian downtowns that had languished since the beginning of the Depression experienced an urban renaissance in the late 1950s and 1960s. Two of the outstanding urban design projects of that time were Toronto's new City Hall and Plaza and Montreal's Place Ville-Marie. The most ambitious and spectacular of these projects was Expo 67, the World Exposition that celebrated the 100th birthday of Canada's Confederation. Canadian designers from across the country collaborated with those from around the world to create a stunning vision of the architecture, landscape architecture, urban transportation, and environment of the modern era. They built Expo 67 on a largely man-made archipelago in the St. Lawrence River, linked to the downtown area and incorporating a series of magnificent parks that remain today as a legacy of Expo. A few years later, Toronto recreated its waterfront on Lake Ontario with a combined futuristic theme park and network of parks and lagoons, Ontario Place. And in the downtown area, a number of excellent private developments were realized, including the multi-floor waterfall landscape of the Four Seasons Hotel opposite Toronto City Hall. In Vancouver, the striking 3-block-long Law Court project, created by architect Arthur Erickson and landscape architect Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, was one of many groundbreaking projects. In Canada's capital region of Ottawa and Gatineau, the National Capital Commission oversaw a large-scale reorganization and rebuilding of the federal precinct in close collaboration with the municipalities. A number of smaller-scale urban jewels, such as Don Graham's elegant Garden of the Provinces and Territories, were realized as part of this overall large-scale project. Revolutionary changes in higher education took place across Canada from the 1950s to the 1970s. Higher education expanded dramatically through the growth of existing universities and the founding of new ones. Many of these involved outstanding campus designs by leading architects and landscape architects. A new realization of the environmental issues facing the country became evident in the late 60s and 70s, and landscape architects led large-scale efforts to rehabilitate damaged landscapes. They also created new regional parks to protect key natural resources and to prevent environmental disasters. The North presents special environmental challenges, and these are becoming more urgent as the impacts of climate change are amplified at higher latitudes. The landscape design for the new Northwest Territories Legislative Building in Yellowknife by Cornelia Hahn Oberlander developed strategies to deal with melting permafrost and other serious issues. And in Montreal, the 1991 Beach Park, located on the Expo Island Park in the St. Lawrence River, employed a system of filter lakes to recycle and clean the water through the use of aquatic plants. Botanists from the Montreal Botanic Garden provided close collaboration to make the project a success. There have been a lot of new developments in Canadian landscape architecture over the last several decades. Among them was a resurgence of interest in horticulture and planting, an important part of the field that had been seriously neglected since the dominance of the modern movement in the post-war years. New botanic gardens and public gardens in the Maritimes and elsewhere, like the Kingsbrae Gardens in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, that we see here, are fine examples, along with the historic Annapolis Royal Gardens in Nova Scotia and the Floralie exhibitions in Montreal and Quebec City. Another growing new trend has been the creation of public gardens, structures, and plazas that honor particular cultural traditions, like the Gate to Victoria's Chinatown and Montreal's series of plazas along St. Lawrence Boulevard, this one recognizing the contribution of Montrealers of Latin American background. Outstanding Japanese gardens have been created in many cities across the country, including the Lethbridge Nikayuko Garden, established in 1967 to mark Canada's centennial. We also see a tribute garden in British Columbia's Slocan Valley that recalls the Second World War incarceration of Japanese Canadians. The Japanese Garden in Montreal's Botanic Garden is another fine example. The recognition of Canada's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis populations has also become an important focus of recent public landscapes. In close collaboration with Indigenous Canadians, landscape architect Gary Hilderman led the design team for the dramatic O'Dina celebration space, an important component of a vast overall redevelopment scheme for the Forks in Winnipeg, which is a traditional meeting place for many First Nations. A main feature of the Forks is the marina and amphitheater on the Assiniboine River. Finally, landscape design has, in the last few decades, begun to expand its design vocabulary in exciting new directions. An imaginative generation of young designers responded to the challenges of special garden exhibitions, including that of the Jardin de Métis in Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula, now in its 23rd year, and the 2006 Flora International Festival at Montreal's Vieux-Port. Their design innovations sometimes involve the use of untraditional materials such as chain-link fences, crushed glass, which is really quite safe, and transparent plastic discs, while other gardens reimagined classical landscape traditions like beach furniture and Muskoka chairs from an entirely new point of view. We see this in Claude Cormier's Canada's Sugar Beach on the Toronto waterfront. We can surely expect that these recent tendencies will continue to develop and that they will be joined by new concerns and approaches, aesthetic, social, and environmental. Let's look at some of the challenges that the profession currently confronts. One major challenge lies in the accelerating transformation of Canada's agricultural landscapes. Much of the land that was once farmed and supported a rich social milieu is being abandoned in favor of a much smaller number of much larger farms, highly mechanized and intensively cultivated. And heritage landscape elements like the iconic wooden grain elevators that anchored the towns of the West are being torn down and replaced by gigantic terminal elevators constructed of concrete and possessing little aesthetic distinction or symbolic value. Many of our urban and suburban landscapes suffer from an overwhelming sameness, a quality they share with landscapes around the world. This scene is located on the main road that connects Hamilton, Ontario, to its airport at Mount Hope, but it could be anywhere in the country, or a lot of other countries. The impacts of climate change have ravaged urban and rural landscapes, breaking all the rules and calling into question our careful calculations of 100-year storms and normal temperatures. New meteorological phenomena are creating dramatic climate changes to which landscape architects must, within their own areas of expertise, respond. On the left is an aerial view of the Peace Athabasca Delta in northern Alberta, the largest inland freshwater delta on the continent. The proximity of this delta to the oil sands operations has raised concerns about water quality and quantity in this crucial water system. The volume and complexity of the oil sands industry impact vast areas of the province. Oil sands companies are constantly improving their technologies and have adopted rehabilitation strategies to diminish and reverse environmental impacts. But the scale of operations is vast, and the renaturalized areas are attractive park-like landscapes that do not really recreate the original landscape character of the milieu. These and other landscape challenges await both the landscape architecture profession and the general society. Based on the remarkable achievements of the past, particularly those of critical periods like the Depression, I think we can look forward with cautious optimism. This conference is based on a series of PowerPoint presentations that I delivered across the country in 2014 following the publication of my book entitled Landscape Architecture in Canada. You can purchase the book through the publishers, McGill Queen's University Press and the Presse de l'Université de Montréal. Both the book and the cross-country lecture tour were very generously supported by the CSLA and the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to both of them. If you found this talk interesting, you might like to look at the other conferences in this series, all of which are available on the CSLA's YouTube channel. Thank you very much. See you next time.